As T.S. Eliot said, April is the cruelest month. With the energy price cap going up and council taxes being hiked, many households in the UK will see their expenses mounting at the beginning of the new financial year. Add to that the cost of water. Water bills in England and Wales will rise by an average of £123 a year. Obviously, households can't choose their supplier, meaning that if Anglian Water sticks an extra £100 on your annual bill, you can't just go with a cheaper option. And some companies are taking the piss more than others. Thames Water customers are facing an increase of 31%, meaning that the average annual bill will go from £488 to £639. Out of interest, did anyone at home see their pay go up by 31% in the last year? No? Thames Water is struggling under a debt mountain of £20 billion. Their previous owner, Australian investment bank Macquarie, loaded Thames Water with more than £7 billion worth of debt while paying out massive dividends before selling their stake in 2017. Good riddance to bad rubbish, right? Well, not exactly. They still own a controlling stake in Southern Water, whose bills are going up by significant amounts as well. If you're unlucky enough to be with them, you'll see your bills increase from £478 per year to £703. That's a hike of almost 70%. Southern Water recently had their credit rating downgraded as they've struggled to get on top of a £6 billion debt pile. Since Macquarie sold their stake, Thames Water has since flirted with insolvency. And even though the regulator has given them permission to increase customer bills by up to 35% by 2030, they're still in need of cash. Thames Water argued that they need a 53% rise in order to fix pipes and keep up with demand. But that's not entirely true. This is from The Express. Over a third of customers' bills for water in England and Wales are not used for water and sewerage services, researchers have revealed. An average of 35% of customer bills in 2023-2024 was taken out to pay for the interest on water companies' debt piles and to pay dividends to the shareholders, experts at the University of Greenwich found. So, if your water bill is £600 a year, more than £200 of that is going towards paying for interest on debts and cashing out to shareholders. When water was privatised, there was no debt at all. Now there's more than £60 billion worth of debt across the industry. So much for private sector competence, eh? The actor Steve Coogan, who's been campaigning against water companies pumping sewage into rivers and lakes, said this to BBC Breakfast.
This is a direct result of a 35-year-old experiment in privatisation that has failed because the reason there are toxic algae blooms in the lake, and they've been increasing, is because of the human sewage, which acts as a fertiliser and makes these algae blooms toxic in the middle of summer. And that is a direct result of the fact that United Utilities don't have the network capacity to deal with it. And the reason they don't have that is because of chronic underinvestment over the last 35 years, where all the profits have been paid out in dividends to shareholders and not invested in the infrastructure that's required to keep the lake clean for ordinary people.
Some money has been pledged.
Some money. It's so
getting
insignificant.
better.
It's getting better. It's a fundamentally broken system. The 35 years, 80 billion has been paid out in customer dividends from all the water utilities in this country. 80 billion over 35 years. 80 billion. And they're talking about spending 75 million quid here and there. It's piffle. It's nothing. The system is broken. Their priority will always be the shareholders. Whatever they say, however many pretty initiatives they have with hosting Green Conference and all the rest of it, the priority will always be their shareholders. I mean, my personal opinion is it should be taken back into public ownership. So any money generated is put into the system. It's the people's lake. This experiment hasn't worked. There's no competition out there. It's a monopoly.
For listeners on the podcast, you can't see that Steve Coogan looks a lot like Jeremy Corbyn at the moment. I don't know if it's just the camera angle or the glasses, but the resemblance is uncanny. Anyway, no wonder more than 80% of Brits, including 70% of Tory and 82% of Reform voters, want to see water brought back into public ownership. That isn't, unfortunately, the Labour government's position. In fact, you might remember that last year they cited analysis paid for by water companies in order to argue against the nationalisation of the sector in England. So the government are out of step with the public when it comes to whether or not to keep water in private hands. But in these increasingly divided times, they have managed to foster a degree of cross-party consensus about one thing. Everyone thinks they're handling the cost of living crisis poorly. This is from recent YouGov polling. 81% of Britons think that the Labour government are managing the cost of living crisis badly. That's pretty much what people thought of the Tories in the immediate aftermath of Liz Truss's prime ministerial disaster class. Now, here's a breakdown of that result by 2024 voting affiliation. You've got more Labour voters and Lib Dems who feel favourably towards Labour, but still a clear majority saying that the government is doing badly. And sure, it's probably no surprise that most Tory and Reform voters think Labour is making a hash of it. But it will probably come as a shock for Labour that so many of their own voters, 2/3, think that the government that they elected not even a year ago is doing such a bad job. So, Helena, do you think that Labour are missing out on easy wins and that they could create some reassurance that they're on the front foot? Or do you have some sympathy with the idea that they've inherited some difficult and complicated economic circumstances that any government would struggle with?
I think there is elements of both. I think that there's a lot of misinformation that Labour have a poor attempt at trying to push back on. So, for example, no one believes their claim about the £22 billion black hole, which, to be fair, half of that isn't true, but the half of which accounts for departmental overspends from the Conservative budgets that they overtook in July. But basically all of this is true. And the rest of that black hole that they claim was left over is the pay awards they've given to public sector workers. And whilst, of course, I believe that they should be paying these public sector workers, and it was a good thing they did that because it ended all of the industrial action. Trying to market this as something that the Tories left us on, we have to raise taxes, not our fault, rather than making the positive case for why this was important and necessary and why those taxes were necessary. They've not bothered trying to give the positive justification for the policies that they've enacted, and people have just essentially said, well, you've made up some numbers and now you're justifying it, because that's essentially what happened when George Osborne did the same thing in 2010, just with budget cuts rather than tax rises. They've had a lot of problems in terms of the geopolitical economic climate, all of the Trump problems. Everyone kind of said in January when bond yields spiked that it was Rachel Reeves' terrible budget that did this, all of the taxes on the businesses, the poor business owners, they're losing confidence, and this means that bond yields have gone up. And I'm like, no, this was international factors. Otherwise, that would have happened when the budget was announced in October rather than now. So there is some sympathy that I have just in kind of the broad level to which that the economy is in not a great place, and they have inherited a lot of problems that I think people kind of misunderstand in broad popular discussion around what the Labour government have been doing. The problem, of course, is that even if you take those things out, they're also missing out on basically anything that they could do to be able to help the cost of living due to their own fiscal rules that they've imposed upon themselves, which are nonsensical. Even former Bank of England economists have said that it's nonsense to have these fiscal rules and they should change it. Andy Haldane, I said, believe we shouldn't be having fiscal rules that are self-constraining. Their own promises on taxation, those things are constraining themselves in a way that they wouldn't need to. And their own desire for certain kinds of policies has also caused them to look like they don't care. Why would you take money away from the disabled? They say they want to fund the arms increase, the increase in defence budget, and yet they just said, well, the poors can deal with it. And at the same time, in the voters' minds, because there's this zero-sum idea of government spending, that the fiscal rules and the household budget analogy are getting into the public consciousness and the public zeitgeist, where they think, well, if money's going from one area of government spending, then it must be taken from another area of government spending. So the popular narrative at the moment is they're taking money from the poor, the elderly and the disabled, and it's going to migrants in hotels, when of course they need to accommodate them whilst their claim is being heard. This is the Refugee Convention. They think that Labour are making the choice to do this when they have to do these things. They have to do these things. And of course, these asylum numbers are so high because caseworkers were cut under the Conservatives, and therefore there's a giant queue for people to get there. So this narrativization has failed them. And then when you come to the things that they could change but are refusing not to for ideological reasons, let's look at the water companies, the main kind of thrust of the argument that was being made in the segment there, which is that They could nationalise them. Steve Reed was on Question Time saying, well, it cost all this money to nationalise them. Like, well, it's costing us money to pay the bloody bills right now. It's costing us loads of money to do that. And I understand you've got fiscal rules, you want to stick to them. But let's be real about the fact that the average person in this country is hurting right now. The people on the bottom rung of the ladder, those are the people who are most affected by rising bills, because they're the ones with which the proportion of their overall income is spent on bills is much higher than people who have very high incomes. So it's disproportionately targeted at those who are the poorest. So that's why they are moving towards reform. Like, Reform are polling the highest amongst people who earn less than 20k. They have nothing that Reform UK are offering them. But Labour's promise these people is so terrible that they don't even bother engaging with it and are looking towards some kind of populist alternative. And when you look at, well, why aren't they nationalising it? For example, Thames Water, the biggest offender in these cases, these are people who have liabilities that far outstrip any of their own assets when it comes to, evaluating the share price. You look back what happened with Northern Rock in the 2000s, the Labour government, when they were a little bit more forthright in their desire to do right by the public and weren't running scared of implementing policies that were seen kind of unpopular when it comes to a broad consensus like nationalisation, Gordon Brown just said, no, we're nationalising Northern Rock. People's savings need to be protected. And because their liabilities are greater than their assets, we're going to nationalise them basically for nothing. They took the government to court. The shareholders of Northern Rock took the government to court, and they lost. And the government made to nationalise Northern Rock basically for pennies on the pound, They could do the same with Thames Water due to the egregious levels of over-indebtedness. So they're having to take out huge 9% interest loans just to keep the lights on at Thames Water HQ. And they're trying to expect bill payers to pay for that. This is an insane system that any normal government would be getting rid of. So why? Why aren't the Labour government taking the easy way out? Well, like Novara Media reported before the election, but no one else seemed to care about, their benches are full of people from the lobbying sector. Take, for example, Jade Botterill, the MP for Ossett and Denby Dale. She was somebody who was previously a corporate affairs advisor for Yorkshire Water, a private water company. You look at Water UK, which is a lobby group that represents a consortium of water companies. It's chaired by Ruth Kelly. She was a cabinet minister in the Blair government. Like there are so many links between the private sector in terms of lobbying and the current people within the Labour Party. And why would they engage in something that is contrary to the interests of the sector for which there are lobbyists for among their benches? Why would they do that? Of course they're not going to do that. Otherwise, why would they have appointed those MPs in the first place? There is not just an ideological but a material incentive given the people who are the ones who've been shoved onto Labour benches now rather than the candidates they should be having, which is people from blue-collar backgrounds that Labour is traditionally supposed to get into Parliament, have been replaced by suits for corporate interests. So of course they're not going to nationalise the water companies, even though when it comes to the things they do want to spend money on, they're being curtailed by high interest rates and a quantitative tightening program for the Bank of England that's being justified by the fact that inflation hasn't reached the 2% target. And yet the only two things that are increasing in price that are pushing the inflation rate headline to 2.8% are increases in water and energy bills, which aren't increasing because of some level of high demand, excess demand, giving us a demand pull inflation. It's total greed. It's greed from national monopolies and price gouging and the paying down of insane debts on money that was taken out by water companies to pay off shareholders that go to private equity companies in Australia. This is an insane system that anybody in their right mind would want to rip up for the interests of voters. And yet, even though we are seeing the political capitulation of Labour to Reform UK amongst so many demographics, they don't want to do. And it shows me that there must be something other than their desire to be popular that's getting in the way of that. And you only have to look at the kind of people who they have wanted to have as their MPs on their benches to see why that might be.